Saad Mohseni, thank you very much for making time available and coming on the show to tell your story.
Thank you, Roh.
Um, I've just about finished your book, through Radio Afghanistan. And now, before we get into that, I wanted to take you back a bit into your childhood. Now, the eldest of the four siblings, the son of a diplomat, very well connected from both sides of the family. Um, so born in London, of all places, raised in Afghanistan, Japan, and Australia, you are you don't share much with a typical Afghan child. So, just give us a bit of a flavor of how your childhood was.
I don't share much with any child. I don't think. Yeah, well, listen, my life was very um, all over the place, as you can say, as you've described. Born in London, we moved back to Kabul when I was about three. We actually drove from London to Afghanistan, a convoy of four or five families. And I think I had my birthday in Damascus along the way, but I actually just found the pictures recently. Me as a sort of 2.5 year old with my parents and a car with, suitcases on top. And then we were in Afghanistan for a number of years. And when I was seven, we moved to Pakistan, where my father was the deputy chief of mission. And we were there for about 3 years. We moved back to Afghanistan, and then we moved to Japan when I was 12 in 1978. And the Russians invaded in 1980 or late 79. My father resigned. We stayed in Japan for another 2 years, and then towards the end of 1982, we moved to Australia. So it was, and then we were in Australia for a number of years, and then I moved back to London in my 20s to work. Um, so it was an interesting upbringing. Certainly one I enjoyed as a kid, despite the challenges and difficulties of going to new schools. I went to, I think, seven or eight different schools. Um, but it was one I wouldn't trade for anything. For me, it was okay. I'm not sure about my siblings. We all had our challenges, but but we remained quite close to Afghanistan. We always spoke Farsi at home. We had Afghan food. The family was always intent on returning to Afghanistan, perhaps deluding themselves. So we always had this sort of this the desire to get back if the opportunity ever presented itself.
But growing up, did you feel yourself being a refugee? Did you think about it that way?
No, I never, weirdly, I never thought of myself as a refugee. When we moved from Australia, from Japan to Australia, I was 16. Uh, it was like our previous moves.
Hmm.
It wasn't we went. The times were difficult, by the way, but it seemed seamless and the transition was quite smooth. Um, everyone worked. I certainly had two or three part-time jobs, even as a 16-year-old. As a matter of fact, I started working when I was 14 in a coffee shop in Japan. So I'd saved quite a bit of money by the time we moved to Australia. Um, my parents worked, I worked, and my younger brothers, as they, were older, they worked. We never felt, looking back, I suppose things were difficult at times, but we never felt under pressure. It wasn't your typical refugee experience. Certainly, I didn't feel it.
But yeah, how did it feel emotionally, that sense of, lack of belonging, I suppose?
We
So
were
did you
used to
have
it.
that, did you have it in you that, whether you're in London or Tokyo or Melbourne, there's a place that you do not belong, or you growing up and, not out of place, but not belonging either.
Well, I think that as sort of given our upbringing, we felt comfortable wherever very, very quickly, and you adapt and adopt very, very quickly. There were, we never felt like when we went to a school in Japan, sorry, in Australia, I mean, they seemed very unsophisticated to us. We spoke English fluently, albeit with an American accent. As a matter of fact, a lot of people confused us for Americans because we had such heavy, strong American accents. We're all multilingual. We spoke three or four languages. We Australia was not quite
Mm.
developed in those days. Let's put it this way. I'm trying to be generous. So it was we didn't feel inferior at all, as quite the opposite. So we're horrified that people would be throwing garbage out of their car windows, or how unsophisticated a lot of Australians were. This is before Australians, nowadays Aussie kids travel through
Mm.
Europe and the US, and they're well informed, well educated. That was not the case in the early 1980s. So we never felt in any way inferior to the people, that to our new hosts, basically.
Yeah.
Um, so I think our experience was quite different, and I suppose we were very lucky.
But where did you define home? The Afghans, they have a concept. We have a concept
Yeah.
of watan, right? For your parents, it's obvious, they had a big part to play in their country's history, its making, its politics, its foreign policy, etc., etc. But for you to be, a kind of an international child, where was home? Where was the
It was always
watan?
it was always Afghanistan. We never denied being Afghans. We were actually quite proud of it,
Hmm.
stubbornly proud. It's in my book, that when I was in Tokyo, my speech teacher warned me that if you do one more, speech about Afghanistan, we'll have to kick you off the class. And so, yeah, I mean, and I do recall in Australia, just like the US, perhaps even the UK, when you go to a new country, try to adapt as quickly as possible. So you adopt British things, whether it's a
Hmm.
British name or British identity, or you try to, assimilate as quickly as possible. It was quite the opposite for us. We were sort of stubbornly Afghan throughout. And that never stopped. And that was the case in other countries, and it certainly was the case in Australia. And of course, when we were in our 20s, then it was too late. We were very much defined by being Afghans first.
Yeah, and the goings in Afghanistan, looking at your parents, and in the book you rightly talk a lot about your parents and the sacrifices that they went through. Um, so I'm really interested in you looking back at to, how they were dealing with all the very, very ugly stuff going on in their country and their people suffering, and they being so far away from it. And how did that translate that emotions between you and your parents?
My parents were very stoic. I joke that, when people say which part of Afghanistan do they come from, I say from the Nordic part of Afghanistan. They tend to um, not complain. My father passed away last year, but
Oh, sorry to hear
um,
that.
he was in his late 90s. Actually, he was 97 when he passed away. He and my mother as well. They're very stoic. Quite determined, proud, but not impractical. And my father was a career diplomat. He actually started his career when he was when Eisenhower was the president in the United States. So he had served for a long time. And when we came to Japan, he worked for a private company for a period, and then he worked for the UN in Cambodia. But they were not, they were not afraid of working. They were not afraid of getting their hands dirty. They were not afraid. I mean, they were educated
Hmm.
uh, and worldly, which helped. Um, but nonetheless, I do recall that things were difficult. but no one complained about things. Um, and they had the right attitude. And yes, their lives would have been very different had the coup had not happened. But I don't, we're not of the kind that uh, look back and say, "Oh God, if things had been different." You just sort of you get
Mm.
on with things, which is exactly the attitude they had, which I think and I hope we also have as kids. But we remained very connected to Afghanistan, whether it was news of the Civil War or prior to that of the communist era. And we didn't have too many family members left inside the country, but we followed the news very, very closely.
But in the book, one of the, I suppose, very familiar passage to anyone who, come from Watan, let's say, and have that sense, that kind of innate urge to continuously remain connected to it. And the further you're away from it, and the more painful it becomes without you really kind of thinking, how did this pain begin and where it's going to end? And in the book, you call it slow death, which was such a strong way of expressing, the longer that you stayed away from the country, the more it felt like, slow death. And I suppose, was that, fighting back your response to leave Australia and go to Uzbekistan just to be closer to what you called home?
Well, yes, I think that my great grandfather was a trader, and my great uncle was actually the first person to export Central Asian products to London, and his name was Abdulaziz, but he was known as Abdulaziz al-Landani because he was the first person to establish a company in London in the I think in 1910 or something, and he had very strong relationships across Central Asia, including Bukhara and Samarkand. As a matter of fact, he had a huge warehouse in Termez, and they would, of course, export things via British India in those days,
Mm.
via Karachi, to both Europe and also to North America. And he was the person that exported karakul for the first time over
Ah,
100
okay.
years ago to Central Asia. So he had that connection in Central Asia. So we were always intrigued by Bukhara and Samarkand. As a matter of fact, the Emir of Bukhara moved to Afghanistan after the Russians took over Central Asia. Um, I'm not sure exactly when he moved, but he moved under the protection of my and support, financial support of my great grandfather and my great uncle. Um, so there was this connection to Central Asia. So I was always intrigued by these two ancient cities, which we had all read so much about.
Mm.
And I but of course my move to Central Asia was also the fact that I'd worked in banking for 12 years. I was only 30. I didn't complete my university studies. I started working and I was successful as a banker, and but by the age of 30 I was actually quite tired and looking for new opportunities. So I sort of retired at 30, started to play golf every day, and then that was boring. So I was reading this book. Someone gave me a book. I think it was called Goodbye, Mr. Lennon. It was about the breakup of the Soviet Union. And this is in 1994 or
Mm.
95. And then the book, this guy's traveling through the Soviet Union and tells the story of the breakup and how it's impacting all these republics.
Yeah.
So I was totally intrigued. So I said to my brothers, I say, hey, why don't we go and visit these places? We went to Pakistan to visit some family in Peshawar and Islamabad, um, a country where we had lived as kids in the 70s. And then we went to Tashkent, where
Mm.
a cousin lived. As most Afghans, we have a cousin somewhere. I had a couple of cousins in Tashkent. And I thought, wow, this is an interesting place. It was very Soviet, yet very Central Asian. And I thought I'll just give it a go and, start a few businesses in this place, which is exactly what I did.
Yeah, but that, you've got that entrepreneurship in your DNA, I suppose. So, it's not surprising that you've got to where you've got. It runs
By the
through the
way, I
family.
mean, Uzbekistan was a complete and total failure from a business perspective. I mean, it wasn't
But
like
the endeavors were there. So, that kind of a
we
sense of
tried,
restlessness. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are so many of my friends, Afghan Americans and Afghan Brits and others who went there and have made had huge successes. We did not. But I think what we did manage to do was we got to know the region, we got to know the Afghans. A lot of Afghans were coming through the political types
Mm.
because, as you recall, the Northern Alliance was stuck in the north.
Yeah.
And the Taliban, of course, had the rest of the country. But the Northern Alliance members could not travel via Pakistan. So they had to go to Tajikistan and then from Tajikistan get to Uzbekistan, which was actually quite a complicated way of traveling because they had to fly to Khojan and from
Yeah.
Khojan they drove to Tashkent, which was a 3 hour drive. And in those days, the borders between Tajikistan and Uzbekistan were pretty sealed. And the friendship bridge connecting Afghanistan to Uzbekistan was also closed. So, but nonetheless, they got through. Taliban, Mutawakkil and others came
Yeah.
on
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
number of occasions, and then of course the Northern Alliance leadership, um, members of the Jumbish Party, Wahdat, Jamiat, all of them were in Tashkent from, especially between the years of, 97, 98 till 2000. So we were exposed to them
Hmm.
and other Afghans, and it sort of was an interesting time to get to know Afghanistan, to, reconnect with Afghanistan.
But I also found the emotional part about the book, which would be familiar to anyone who've lived in exile as refugees or otherwise, that 2002 homegoing, I suppose, that struggle to get into that Ariana plane at Dubai airport and arriving at Kabul, where, you go through a lot of emotional details about this is home. I've arrived to where I belong. I know the streets, I know the air, I smell, this sense of being that I have. Y- You know, that is, in a sense, is that the making of Saad Mohseni?
Well, I'm not sure about other Afghans, but for me, um, the what I feel about my homeland, my country, my people is perhaps it's the only consistent thing in my life,
Hmm.
right? You love your children, of course, but we don't have kids till we're much older, so it's an experience that we have in our 20s or 30s. And then once they get older, of course, you love your grandkids and all that. I mean, it's sort of it's not always there, but the what I felt for the country and its people and the air and the light, it's something that's always been with me. And I think partially it was because I was not always there.
Hmm.
I remember the most exciting holiday I had, when I was 8 was I went to Kabul from Islamabad with one of my father's colleagues, and I stayed in Kabul for a month. But I remember that being as one of my, most exciting holidays. Even as a 4 or 5 year old, going to my grandfather's orchard, which then, of course, we would visit always. This has been one of the most consistent things in my life.
Hmm.
And it's what's strange is, and I've put this in the book as well, is that when I've asked other people, foreigners, Americans, Brits, others, who have also caught this bug, this Afghan bug, they also attempt to describe what draws them to the country, whether it's the mountains or the autumn light or the color of the leaves or the people or the food or the mountains or whatever. It's there's something it's difficult to define, but what you feel is what you feel. And I think that trip to Kabul, that first time, after 2 decades plus, was memorable in the sense that there were these emotions that we all had on that plane,
Mm.
that we all experienced. And and it's one that never leaves us quite.
And a keen eye for opportunities, given where the country was at the time and your odyssey, in a sense, to you and your brothers to, find a company to create a business, and then you fall into founding Moby. So give us a bit of a rundown in, how Moby became.
Well, I was so my back, I went back to Australia in 1999. I went back into banking with some of my former colleagues, and within a couple of years, actually, we took advantage of the boom e-commerce um, time. It was the sort of the first,
Dot-com bubble, as this,
the
so.
yeah, the first, dot-com 1.0. Um, it was quite a good 2 or 3 years. And my brother was a partner of the law firm. My other brother was a financial analyst at a major finance company. My sister was a marketing manager at NEC, which is a Japanese electronics company. So we were actually quite comfortable, and I had resettled. I was actually quite comfortable in Australia, and I love Australia. I love Melbourne. It is home. And we went back to, of course, 9/11 happened. We went back to Afghanistan. And I thought, it's a sentiment shared by my siblings that we have to do something and
Mm.
that will, keep us engaged in Afghanistan. That something was, we should look at the private sector. We should look at investing. We thought if we create a small fund that would take advantage of, this economy that's bound to develop,
Mm.
albeit from a low base, we could make a success of a small number of businesses. So the idea was never to go back full time. The idea was to create like a fund of sorts that would invest in different sectors. And I've mentioned almonds as one example, cultivation of almonds.
Yeah.
Afghanistan was one of the world's big exporters in the 70s. And there was no reason for us not to, become another, to again make our mark basically in terms of our exports. And there were opportunities. There was an Australian listed company that specialized in almond cultivation that we connected to. And there were other opportunities that we looked at, the services, logistics, and so forth. The media thing sort of happened by accident in that Ahmed Rashid, the author, was in Washington, and he was a friend, and he was having dinner with Andrew Natsios, who was the head of USAID. And I think even without asking us, he broached the topic. And I think Natsios was very interested. So he came to me and said, listen, if you guys want to do media, I think they're receptive to helping you. And at the time, I actually had looked at the FM radio station opportunity in Uzbekistan. So I knew basically just sort of at a very high level
Mm.
what that would entail in terms of infrastructure investment. So we said, yeah, we'd be interested. And it was only a $220,000 grant. It was a very small grant. And we put up the rest of the money, which at that time I think was $350,000. And we set up this business. Again, it was going to be one of many businesses we would invest in. But it was so controversial. It was like a lightning bolt
Mm.
that me initially, and then my siblings, we had to get involved. It was good and it was stressful, but it was a business that we could not delegate its management to anyone else.
And also, kind of the launching of Arman FM and the way you launched it, the music, the coziness of the presenters, the youthfulness of the whole thing, kind of soaking into that, new millennia, I suppose, that opened up opportunities for Afghanistan. What I found interesting was also the people of Afghanistan had lived in this under this gray belt for a bit and for a long time, I suppose. And you were intending through Arman to kind of blanket it with a bit of color and not everybody was used to it. And you're scratching people or tickling people in places where they liked it, but they were not comfortable with. So it just come across as that. And I suppose there were a lot of risks that you all had to take. And your female presenter, whom you could not reveal, the age, the real name, and, making jokes about her weight and things like that. And it was just, the country was receptive, but to start with, uncomfortable in a sense.
Yeah, I mean so I was in my 30s. We were willing to push the envelope. Sometimes we pushed perhaps too far. Nonetheless, you figure things out. You try things and see what sticks. What we felt, and we've since discovered, because we've had businesses all over the world, from Africa to the Middle East to South Asia, and so forth, is how similar we are in terms of
Mm.
the way we react to things, whether it's music or soap operas or reality television. Um, was why not go with a format that has worked elsewhere, which is sort of a fun FM radio network format of chit
Yeah.
chat, news, weather, traffic, a little bit of gossip. And then we threw in some other interesting tidbits, like a psychiatrist taking in people's calls in the evenings, for example.
Yeah.
And then we had also in-depth interviews with people, and then people had the ability to call in um, issues they had with the government or with the authorities. So then all of a sudden, it was a format that was, a format that had succeeded elsewhere, not necessarily in the West or the East, but a format that had worked in many places. And then we Afghanized it along the
Yeah.
way. And and, and so the foundation was a format that had succeeded, but then by throwing a lot of other stuff at it, it became very local
Mm.
and very contemporary and very relevant. But the important thing for us was how to find the right people and how to empower them. Um, you cannot, we in a lot of ways we were not qualified
Yeah.
to, we had been away from the country for 20 years. So what do? You empower people who'd been there all along, or people who just arrived back from Pakistan or Iran. And and I think that's one of the reasons why we succeeded, because a lot of the ideas were not our ideas. They came from the people who worked for us.
Yeah. And also, then Tulu TV came along, which again revolutionized or introduced the people of Afghanistan to the new media. And, introduced soap operas from the region where people, some of which were culturally already introduced to, but some were not. And I remember, many years ago, I was here talking to somebody in Afghanistan, to the village, and I asked them, "Where is the rest? Where is everybody?" And this aunt said, "Oh, you've called us in the wrong time because everybody's busy watching Tolo. And what is it that you're watching?" It's, "Oh, this Turkish soap opera, and everybody's so crazy about it." And then it's, "Oh, have you seen the women? The women, they're so beautiful, they're so different." Now, think about it. In a remote village in Hazarajat, that there's women looking at, Toulouse, seeing women could be dressing differently. They could be talking about things differently. They would be playing different roles in their societies. And that planted ideas into their heads about their place in society and history. That was a big, big thing. And the way, Toulouse took over the Afghan media scene, and then Toulouse News, of course, and the immense amount of power and influence that it brought for you. How did that feel?
Well, first and foremost, I mean, I think you attempt to provide the best entertainment uh, imaginable,
Mm.
which is, I think a lot of people assume that we had always an agenda in terms of social engineering and facilitating or fast tracking social change. I think that's a byproduct of good content.
So
You
that
know
was
what?
not an intention at all.
Well, some things were, for example, like, women's rights and education for people, sending your kids to school, or inoculating your kids, or visiting the doctor. All those things were by design. We had programs that promoted those sorts of things. But in terms of what sort of furniture you should have at home, because I remember this company that imported Turkish furniture, I was very thankful, because he said ever since your soap operas, demand for Turkish furniture has gone through the roof. People went through a phase of watching Indian soap operas and wanting to buy saris and stuff that they would see in an Indian household because of these soap operas, to transitioning to the Turkish variety. But that wasn't by design. That was just because these programs were very popular and these people became role models, and their homes and their cars were also attractive to these people, to our viewers, that is. So I think yes, but you have to remember that what Afghans experienced in that 20-year period is what everyone else has experienced over the last 100+ years, since the emergence of television and even radio. Societies have changed very, very quickly, because then media allows media allows people to see what's out there, whether it's furniture, whether it's ideas, whether it's clothing. It allows for people to look at, to see that they have options. And I think for Afghans, for so long, cut away from the rest of the world, that this 20-year period has been transformational, because they've been exposed to things outside. And today, in 2024, it's been 23 years since the fall of the first Taliban regime.
Yeah.
People have a sense of what the world is about, whether it's through soap operas and music, video clips, but also through news stories and current affairs programs and documentaries and interviews and so forth. So the Afghan population is a lot better informed than it's ever been in its history. Now, I come from a family that it was establishment in the 70s and prior to that. This whole idea of Afghanistan, of this very modern, progressive country in the 1970s, is a complete myth. Our literacy in 1978 was 8%. It was the most exclusive society on the planet. And I point this out because I think we have to be truthful with ourselves. For example, people talk about miniskirts and all of that. There were a handful of kids who went to Kabul University or to elite schools that could dress like that. I mean, the rest of the country, the rest of Kabul was very backward. Kabul had a population of 300,000 to 400,000 people. Even in terms of inclusivity, my father, who served in the foreign ministry, at that time in 1978, there was only one Shia that worked for the ministry. Well, not Hazara, one Shia. And he was from a Qizilbash family. I know because he was my father's deputy. His name was Mukhtar Zada. There may have been another one or two, but he was certainly the only one. And I remember my father telling me these things because he wanted to point out that Afghanistan was not an open society. If you were of a minority, you could not serve in the military, or certainly not at sort of officer level. You could not serve in the foreign ministry. And I think the war, the Soviet occupation, was the great equalizer on both sides.
Yeah.
The communists promoted a lot of members of the ethnic communities, but the Mujahideen groups also had to work together. So all of a sudden they were doing, their bit of resistance equally in different parts of the country. So the last 20 years to me have been, this is probably the most important era in our recent history. Not during Amanullah's time, not during King Zahir Shah's time, not during the communist time, but the last 20 years have truly have transformed the country.
Yeah. And, you changed Afghanistan's media landscape. And of course, Moby grew to markets in the Middle East and Africa. But of course, specifically on Afghanistan, you changed the media landscape in a sense that people's perception of the media changed. People's perception of accountability from their government changed as well. And you really, in a sense, cemented the fourth state's position in Afghanistan's political and, social culture. But there were a lot of risks to it as well. You were part of, for some, as you alluded to, for, the enemies of that progressive change, I suppose you were part of the agenda to social engineer Afghanistan to a specific directions from, Afghan staff, from the soaps, from the news, from all of those things. And, the threats came, the violence came, you lost, many journalists, you were a military target by the Taliban. And so let's talk about those risks and responsibilities that you felt on your shoulders every time one of your journalists, for example, got shot at or killed. How did it feel, for Saad Mohseni deep down on an emotional level?
Well, there were always risks, and there were arrests, there were threats, and up until 2016, uh, we had been very lucky that we had no one had been killed up until then. So we started operating in 2003. So for 13 odd years, despite all the risks, we had somehow survived unscathed. In 2016, on January the 20th, a bus of ours was targeted by the Taliban, and 20 of our 30 odd individuals were on that bus. Seven were killed immediately, and another 14 or 15 badly injured. And it was perhaps one of the most devastating experiences of my life, having to deal with such a tragedy. And for me at the time, maybe because I was sleepless and had to fly overnight, it was wondering whether we should close the station because I didn't think it was worth even one life, one innocent life. And I've talked about this in the book that we visited family members, the survivors, family members who'd lost their children, sometimes their sole provider. I mean, for an Afghan family to lose someone, it's so much more devastating than perhaps in other places. I mean, I'm sure the loss of life in the UK and
Yeah,
the
yeah,
US
yeah.
is just as devastating. But then you have someone who's providing for you, you have someone that basically is
It cripples a generation.
it completely and totally does. Um, and to see their families, to console them, um, was perhaps one of the most difficult things I've done. But we put it to our colleagues as to what we should do. And when I told them that I was willing to shut the station down, the news operation, I was quite serious because I
Hmm.
thought, well, nothing's really worth it at the
Yeah.
end of the day. Because you can be all stoic and say, well, great things in life, require great sacrifices. I'm not too sure about that because it's not my right um, to jeopardize other people's lives. And the kids were quite determined to continue. I still wasn't convinced. It took me a while to understand and accept that. And of course, we've had other fatalities since then.
Hmm.
We've lost a total of 12 colleagues over the last 20 odd years. But that incident itself was perhaps one of the most devastating experiences of my life, but which pales in comparison to what their families
Hmm.
felt and
Yeah.
experienced. But this is Afghanistan. I
Yeah.
mean, this is what every family has experienced over the last 40 odd years. I mean, we had the communist coup d'etat in 1978, April 25, 1978, the Russian invasion, Christmas of 1979, and things have not, I mean, it's been 40 plus years of conflict and mayhem for the people of the country.
And the whole story is known as to what happened over the past 3 years. Now, when Afghanistan are falling, you can sense from the book as well, and you had so much at stake as everybody else had, the struggles to be a go-between between politicians, between leaders, foreign leaders, diplomats. But What were your worst fears when you heard Ashraf Ghani had fled, the whole system's fallen?
We we had assumed that the system would collapse because, they say a sausage factory, if once you go inside the sausage factory, you'll never eat a sausage again. We knew the inside workings of the government and of the system. And given the corruption, ineptitude, um, and and how hopeless the
Hmm.
government was in terms of managing things, including the military side of things, it was inevitable that the government would collapse. It was just a question of time. As a matter of fact, and I've mentioned this in the book, I think it's the last two chapters I chronicle
Mm-mm.
the last few weeks, where I visit Washington and I have meetings in the White House and also with the USAID administrator, amongst others. Then I say, listen, I state that the system cannot survive beyond November. And everyone's like, oh, you're exaggerating.
I
You're
was
being
being
an
very generous
alarmist.
of you now.
Yes. And then, of course, I return to Afghanistan and I meet Ashraf Ghani twice in less than 20 hours and in 17, 18 hours. And then I realized that there's no way he's going to survive because he was belligerent and he was, overly confident. This is late July of 2021. And so I left Afghanistan for the last time. I came to Europe and I did say to my colleagues, I said that it doesn't look good because he just doesn't have the right mindset. And in Afghanistan, I had argued before, it's not a question of one side prevailing on the battleground. Quite often it's, one side lowering a flag and raising another flag. People
Hmm.
are fairly, Afghans are survivors and they understand that if the case is hopeless, why fight? And that's exactly what happened. In the space of 2 or 3 weeks, people switched sides. And then the Taliban were on the outskirts of Kabul. And then Ashraf Ghani fled. And that, of course, broke, you know, triggered the collapse of the government, of the state, of the political process, of the post-Bonn political process. And and basically, even the Taliban were not prepared,
Hmm.
initially at least, to take charge in Kabul. And initially, our concern was mayhem, looting, anarchy, including attacks on our facilities. And then when the Taliban came in and took over the security in Khan, the area where the
Yeah, yeah,
station
yeah.
is based, we're somehow comforted, but we were also concerned as to what they would do to our staff.
And a lot of
Um,
abuse, as you allude to in the book, also followed.
yes, I mean, I think the one thing which was interesting now we can look back is that the leader issued this amnesty, which I think was important, um, because at an institutional level, they didn't seek to, there was, of course, a lot of retribution. People took it upon themselves to settle scores, and these things happened right across the country. But compared to what we expected, it was, it was relatively well managed, that transition. So, but nonetheless, people were concerned. People were panicked. People wanted to get to the airport. People wanted to get out. People wanted to escape via Pakistan or Iran. That sense of panic and doom was present for months after that.
Hmm.
And even to this day, a lot of people are obviously keen to get out. But that sense of, how hopeless we felt and how helpless we felt. I mean, I think for us at that time, it was, a lot of sleepless nights because it was also how to keep the station going. We'd
Yeah,
wake up in
yeah,
the morning, half a dozen people would be missing in the newsroom because they'd be at the airport trying to get out, which,
yeah.
which I don't blame them for attempting to get out. Nonetheless, we had an existential threat in the sense that we had to keep going from a media perspective.
Yeah,
So
and
we
and
made it.
and how do you, characterize the evolution of your outlets now in Afghanistan? And to your critics, they might say, you've been very accommodating to the Taliban. You're the first outlet to in a sense call the Taliban government the government and also call them by their name Islamic Emirates.
Well, I mean, they are the government. They have, total control over the country.
Yeah,
Probably like we have not seen for a long time.
yeah.
I mean, and they are the governing body. They make the
Do you
rules.
understand the perceptions of your
Of
critics?
course, yes, I understand, but we deal with reality.
Mm,
We don't deal with it's we cannot will things into happening. We have to deal with what's happening on the ground. Um, when the Americans have to go and talk to the Afghan government, they meet with the Taliban. They meet with
yeah.
their representatives in Doha, or I'm sure that parts of the U.S. government visit Kabul and they talk to them as a governing body or a de facto government. And they refer to them as the Emirate of Afghanistan. So it's they're the people in charge,
Mm.
and we run our operation um, in a country that they effectively control.
But the impacts of their rule on your operations, the restrictions that continues to build up and build up. I mean, is there a point that you think that you will not be able to continue to operate as a media outlet in the country where, so one of the recent decrees, for example, although it's kind of, quite scattered in a sense, that you will not be able to broadcast living things. Those restrictions on your outlet and other media outlets as well. So would there be a moment of point of no return for Moby in Afghanistan?
Absolutely. I mean, for us, it's a day by day proposition. We every day we have to reassess. And we've been doing this for 3 years, by the way. So yes, I mean, we do have our red lines, and there may be a time that it's going to be impossible for us to continue our work from inside of Afghanistan. But it was important for us initially to remain inside the country because we felt that in order to report on issues, we need to have that physical presence with our correspondents across the country and stringers to be able to produce programming for Afghans. You need to have that physical presence inside the country. To be able to gather news for the outside world, we needed to be inside the country. Um, and and if you're not there, it's much more challenging. So, but then again, of course, you always have to balance things.
Mm.
Um, and we have made sacrifices, and we've cut programming that, for example, music, soap operas. But like you said, there may come a time where the space is too confined for us to continue our operations.
And you've always had, throughout your career, you've had very good instincts. And, what does that instinct tells you about, the direction of the country? Are you, as pessimistic as everybody else, or do you see any light at the end of a dark tunnel?
It's mixed. I think I'm optimistic in the sense that, what I talked about before, that the country has been transformed.
Hmm.
Half the country was not born in 2001. We have a population of 42, 43 million people, and 60 or 70% of the population is under the age of 20. If you look at the younger population of Afghans, the vast majority are educated, like 60, 70%. The national average is probably in the mid 30s. If you look at younger Afghans, the under 30s, it's double that, more than double that. There is, in terms of education levels, in terms of sophistication, in terms of the urban experience, most Afghans have been exposed to this new Afghanistan. But even a
Hmm.
small town outside of Kabul, it's technically not a city, but they have an urban experience. A family from Panjshir lives next to a family from Hazarajat that lives next to a family from Jozjan. They commute to Kabul to work during the week. Their kids go to the school. They have an urban experience. They watch television. They listen to the radio. Their kids may be multilingual, but they have an understanding of each other. They're getting their urban experience. Half the population has been exposed to that urban experience. And And because of these huge gains over the last 20 years, from life expectancy to drops in child mortality and so forth, it's a totally different Afghanistan. Now, the Taliban, the government, in terms of its policies, is going to drag Afghanistan back. But on the other side, this new Afghanistan is also pulling the Taliban back the other way, for example. And my mother is in Kabul right now, and she was telling me that, the changes that she sees in their conduct, the way they speak to people, the way they, at least in the major cities, whether it's Herat, Kabul, or Mazar-e-Sharif, is quite different to the way it was in September of 2021, for example. So there's this talk of war between the new Afghanistan and this members of this de facto government, who obviously have to contend with this new Afghanistan. Now, I'm not sure who's going to prevail at the end of the day, but it's not something that's static. It's something that's constantly moving. And what's also interesting is that there are individuals, it's not a monolithic movement. There are individuals who are more pragmatic than others, perhaps even moderate. And they have their own issues within the movement itself in terms of how they should govern over the country. Afghanistan is in deep trouble. Its economy has faltered. Half the population is vulnerable to food insecurity. A third of the country doesn't have insulated housing. If you look at malnutrition numbers, it's like 6-7 million kids are vulnerable. So it's the Taliban need to change their ways if they're to able to govern properly. Otherwise, something has to give. This cannot continue indefinitely.
Yeah. And, I'm very conscious of your time, so thank you very much for being so generous. Now, what are your great hopes for Afghanistan? So let's end this in a more hopeful note from Saad Mohseni.
I think the only option for the Taliban is for them to broaden their governing body. Inclusivity is very important in a country where 60% of the population are today, to a large extent, excluded from the process itself. It's important for them to allow girls to go back to school. I think women's rights are very important from any perspective, Islamic or otherwise. And the world it's not going to be easy for the Taliban to secure what they wish to secure, which is legitimacy or lifting of sanctions, unless things change. The hope is with this new US government that they could revive the Doha Agreement, under which the Taliban have to address things like inclusivity. But I think that's why there's an opportunity for some of the more pragmatic members of the Taliban to take these things into account. And if they're serious about governing, they have to understand that they cannot do it in isolation.
Saad Mohseni, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to hear your story and your thoughts. They've been all very, very fascinating.
Thank you.